Have you ever seen a man's entire empire collapse because of a single word? Not a gunshot. Not a betrayal. Just one word, spoken at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, in front of the wrong people. There is a moment when the past stops hiding. When secrets buried in darkness step into the light, and demand to be answered. What happens when a mafia heir, raised to believe that bloodline is everything, suddenly comes face to face with the son he never knew existed? What happens when a woman who spent years running from a criminal empire decides to walk back into the lion's den, not for revenge, but for truth? And what happens when the most feared man in the room hears a child call him something he has spent years refusing to be? $10 million. That was the price Kong Dae-ho put on my silence. He told me I was a stain on his family's history and that dating his son is a disgrace to his family name. He thought money could buy my dignity. He was wrong. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, or if someone in power tried to erase your existence because of the color of your skin or the status of your birth, this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because I'm about to show you what happens when a mother stops running and starts fighting for the truth. The Crystal Palace towered over the Seoul skyline, a blade of glass and neon cutting into the night. On the top floor, where privacy could be bought and silence was guaranteed, the city's most powerful figures gathered beneath chandeliers of gold and crystal. Waiters moved like shadows. Music floated softly through the air. Every table held a fortune in wine and diamonds. At the center of it all sat Kang Jun-hyuk, the man known in the underworld as the Ice King. Beside him sat his fiancée, chosen as much for her influence as her beauty. Across from him sat his father, the architect of an empire built on fear, and on rules that could never be broken. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Until the doors opened. Every head in the room turned. And I walked in. Holding the son they tried to erase. And in that moment, the dinner stopped. Before the story continues, I would like to ask you a favor. Please tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your country and city. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and hearing from all of you around the world. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story. Now, let's continue. The air on the 90th floor of the Crystal Palace didn't feel like oxygen, it felt like filtered, expensive gold. It was thin, cold, and carried the scent of white lilies and aged sandalwood, the kind of atmosphere that reminded you, with every breath, that you didn't belong here unless your bank account had 10 zeros or your bloodline stretched back to the founding of a dynasty. I stood just inside the heavy, soundproofed mahogany doors, my hand resting on Noah's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor in his small frame. I wasn't sure if he was trembling from the chill of the overactive air conditioning or the sheer weight of the moment we were about to create. I was wearing a red silk dress, a color that felt like a splash of blood in a room of sterile whites and blacks. It was a dress I couldn't afford, bought with the last of my savings from double shifts at the bar, but tonight, it wasn't just clothing. It was a flag of war. The Crystal Palace was exactly as the rumors described, a jagged tooth of glass and steel piercing the Seoul clouds, a place where the laws of the street were replaced by the laws of the elite. Below us, the city was a map of neon veins, but up here, everything was muted, hushed, and terrifyingly calm. The dining room was an expanse of white marble and crystal chandeliers that dripped from the ceiling like frozen rain. Every table was a stage, occupied by the architects of the city's pain and its progress. There were politicians whose smiles were as sharp as the knives they used on their Wagyu steak, and corporate titans who had built empires on the backs of people like me. I looked down at Noah. He was wearing a small, charcoal gray suit, his hair brushed back neatly, revealing the high forehead and the sharp, noble bridge of his nose, features he had inherited from a man who didn't even know he existed. Noah's eyes were wide, taking in the opulence with a quiet curiosity that broke my heart. He didn't see the danger. He didn't see the men in the shadows with earpieces and bulges under their jackets. To him, this was just a beautiful room. As we stood near the reception podium, unnoticed for a heartbeat by the staff who were busy attending to the real guests, Noah's gaze fell on a stack of heavy, cream-colored programs resting on a silver tray. They were embossed with gold foil, commemorating the union of two empires, the engagement of Kang Jun-hyuk and Yoo Ji-eun. Before I could stop him, Noah reached out and picked one up. His small fingers traced the gold lettering, and then he opened it. The centerpiece of the program was a high-resolution photograph of the man of the hour. Kang Junhyuk looked out from the page with an expression of such profound coldness that it seemed to chill the paper itself. He was seated in a leather chair, his hands clasped, wearing a watch that probably cost more than the apartment we had lived in for the last 5 years. He was the Ice King, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his legendary detachment from anything resembling human emotion. I watched Noah's face as he looked at the photograph. I saw the moment the recognition hit him. It wasn't that he had seen this man before, he hadn't, not in person, but he had seen that face every morning in the mirror. He had seen it in the one grainy, half-lit photo I had kept hidden in the back of my jewelry box, the only thing I had left of a night that had cost me everything. Noah looked from the paper to the center of the room, where a long, rectangular table was elevated on a slight dais. At the head of that table sat the man from the program. He was even more imposing in person, his presence acting like a gravitational pull that drew the attention of everyone in the room. Beside him was Yoo Ji-eun, a woman who looked like she had been carved out of a single piece of flawless jade, beautiful, hard, and utterly untouchable. And across from them sat the patriarch, Kang Dae-ho. Seeing him again made my stomach turn. He looked older, his hair a shock of silver, but his eyes were the same, 2 pieces of flint that had once sparked a fire that burned my world down. He was the man who had sat across from me 12 years ago and slid a check for $10 million across a table, telling me that foreign blood was a stain the Kang family would never permit. "Mama," Noah whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft, haunting melody of a live string quartet. He pointed to the program and then to the man at the center table. "It's him. It's the man from the picture." "I know, baby," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to be the pillar he needed. "That's him." Is he the reason we had to go away?" Noah asked. It was a question that held years of unspoken confusion, years of moving from city to city, of watching me look over my shoulder every time a black car lingered too long at a curb. "He's part of it," I replied, smoothing down his lapel. "But tonight, Noah, we aren't going away anymore. Tonight, the running stops." I took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies suddenly cloying, almost suffocating. I remembered the night I met Junhyuk. It wasn't in a palace like this. It was in a smoky, low-lit bar where I was working 3 jobs to keep my family afloat. He had been a man seeking a moment of escape from the crushing weight of his father's expectations, and I had been a woman who saw a soul behind the suit. For one night, the barriers of race, class, and empire had vanished. We had shared stories, laughter, and a connection that felt like it was written in the stars. But the stars had lied. By morning, the machine of the Kang dynasty had ground into gear. His father's men had found me before the sun was fully up, presenting me with an ultimatum: take the money and leave, or watch my family's small business be dismantled piece by piece. I had torn the check into 100 pieces and thrown it in Daeho's face. I thought that was the end of it. I didn't know that the real war was just beginning. I looked around the room, feeling the eyes of the lions starting to drift toward us. A waitress in a red dress and a small boy in a cheap suit didn't fit the aesthetic of the Crystal Palace. We were the lambs who had wandered into the den, and the predators were starting to scent the air. I saw a head waiter, a man with a stiff collar and an even stiffer expression, beginning to make his way toward us, his intent clear. He was going to escort us out before we could disturb the pristine peace of the elite. "Stay close to me," I told Noah. I didn't wait for the waiter to reach us. Instead, I began to walk. I didn't walk like a waitress. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. As we moved deeper into the room, the hushed conversations at the surrounding tables began to die down. The clinking of silver against china ceased. It was as if a cold front was moving through the restaurant, freezing the socialites in mid-gesture. They saw the red dress, a bold, defiant middle finger to their monochromatic world, and they saw the boy. Noah kept his head up. I had raised him to be proud, to know that his worth wasn't defined by the size of his house or the name on his birth certificate. He walked beside me, his small hand tucked into mine, his gaze fixed on the man at the high table. We passed a table of younger men, likely Jun Hyuk's associates, who watched us with a mixture of amusement and confusion. One of them started to make a joke, but the words died in his throat as Noah walked past. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. It was like watching a ghost of Jun Hyuk's youth walk through the room. The head waiter intercepted us halfway to the dais. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "This is a private event. You must have the wrong floor. The service elevators are back the way you came." "I'm exactly where I need to be," I said, not slowing my pace. I didn't look at him. My eyes were locked on Jun Hyuk. He hadn't noticed us yet. He was listening to something his fiancée was saying, a glass of dark red wine held loosely in his hand. He looked bored, as if the entire spectacle of his own engagement was a chore he was performing for the sake of the family business. "Miss, I will have to call security," the waiter persisted, stepping in front of me. "Then call them," I said, finally looking him in the eye. "But unless you want a scene that will be on the front page of every newspaper in the country by morning, I suggest you step aside." The conviction in my voice gave him pause. In a room where power was the only currency, I was speaking with a wealth of certainty that he couldn't account for. He glanced toward the center table, looking for guidance from the patriarch, but Kang Dae-ho was currently engaged in a deep conversation with a man who looked like a high-ranking government official. The waiter hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, I stepped around him. We were now only 20 feet from the table. The string quartet had reached a crescendo, the violins wailing a high, mournful note that seemed to mirror the tension in my chest. I could see the condensation on the champagne buckets. I could see the individual diamonds in Jiun's necklace. And I could see the moment Jun Hyuk finally looked up. It started as a casual glance, a reflex to the sudden silence that had radiated outward from our path. He looked toward the door, then his gaze swept across the room, landing on the woman in the red dress. For a second, his expression remained unchanged, the same mask of aristocratic boredom. Then, his eyes dropped to the boy standing beside me. I watched the Ice King shatter. It wasn't a slow process. It was instantaneous. His pupils dilated, and the hand holding the wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. The boredom vanished, replaced by a shock so profound it looked like physical pain. He didn't look at me, not yet. He was staring at Noah's face, tracing the line of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the very architecture of his own soul reflected in a child he had never met. Beside him, Yoo Ji-yoon noticed the change in her fiancé. She followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as they landed on us. She was a woman who had been trained from birth to spot a threat, and she recognized us as one immediately. Her hand moved to Jun Hyuk's arm, a possessive, grounding gesture, but he didn't seem to feel it. He was lost in the boy. Across the table, Kang Dae-ho finally felt the shift in the room's energy. He turned his head slowly, his predatory instincts alerting him that something had breached the perimeter. When he saw me, his face didn't register shock. It registered a cold, lethal recognition. He remembered the girl who had torn up his money. He remembered the stain he thought he had bleached out of his family's history. His eyes moved to Noah, and for a fleeting second, I saw something that looked like fear in the old man's eyes, the fear of a legacy being dismantled by the very blood he had tried to disown. The silence in the Crystal Palace was now so heavy it was a physical weight. The lions were no longer eating. They were watching the lambs reach the throne. We stopped at the edge of the dais. I let go of Noah's hand, giving him the space to stand on his own. Noah looked up at the man who sat at the head of the table. He didn't see a mafia boss. He didn't see a billionaire. He didn't see the Ice King. He saw the man from the program, the man from the hidden photo, the man who held the answer to every why he had ever asked. In the silence, with the city of Seoul glowing like a fever dream behind us, Noah spoke. His voice was small, but it had the clarity of a bell ringing in a deserted cathedral. It was a word that carried 12 years of longing, 12 years of silence, and 12 years of a mother's struggle. Father? The word didn't just hang in the air, it exploded. I saw the wine glass in Jun Hyuk's hand begin to tremble. I saw the mask of the Khan family crumble. The lions and the lamb had finally met, and in that moment, the Crystal Palace felt less like a fortress and more like a house of cards waiting for the wind to blow. I stood back, my heart hammering against my ribs, and watched the man who had abandoned us look into the eyes of the child he had denied. The dinner hadn't just stopped. The world had stopped. And as the first drop of red wine spilled from Junhyuk's shaking hand onto the white tablecloth, I knew that the throne of glass was about to come crashing down. The word hung in the air like a physical object, heavy and impossible to ignore. It was a small sound, a high-pitched, innocent question that carried more power than a gunshot echoing through the marble halls of the Crystal Palace. For a second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The string quartet's melody faltered and then died away entirely as the musicians lowered their bows, their eyes drawn toward the small boy in the gray suit who had just shattered the most expensive piece in Seoul. Noah didn't look away. He stood with his shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto the man at the head of the table with a terrifyingly pure intensity. I felt the heat of 100 stares burning into my skin, but I didn't flinch. I let go of Noah's hand, allowing him to stand in his own truth, and stepped fully into the pool of amber light cast by the central chandelier. My red dress was a wound in the middle of their perfect, monochromatic world. It was the color of blood, the color of warning, and tonight, the color of a reckoning they never saw coming. I could see the reflection of the candlelight in the polished surface of the table, shimmering like a lake of fire between me and the man I had once loved. Kang Junhyuk looked as though he had been turned to stone. His face, usually an unreadable mask of corporate authority and cold calculation, was beginning to crack. His lips were parted slightly, his breath hitching in his throat, as he stared at Noah. He wasn't looking at me yet, he was searching the boy's face, finding the echoes of his own features, the curve of the brow, the stubborn set of the chin, and those deep, dark eyes that had haunted my dreams for over a decade. Beside him, Eugene's composure was the first thing to truly fail. She was a woman who lived for optics, for the careful management of her public image, and in an instant, her perfect engagement had been transformed into a public scandal. Her hand gripped Junhyuk's sleeve so tightly her knuckles turned a ghostly white, her eyes darting between me and Noah with a mixture of disgust and primal fear. She looked at me not as a woman, but as a parasite, an intruder who had dared to bring filth into her sanctuary. But it was the man across from them, the patriarch, Kang Dae-ho, who drew the most of my attention. He didn't look shocked. He looked murderous. His eyes were narrow slits of flinty gray, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his silk tie. He knew exactly who I was. He remembered the night he tried to buy my womb for $10 million, and he clearly regretted not using more permanent methods to ensure I stayed gone. "Noah," I said softly, my voice carrying through the stifling silence. The sound of my voice finally forced Junhyuk to look up. When our eyes met, it felt like an electric shock. For a heartbeat, the 12 years of pain, the nights of crying myself to sleep in cheap apartments, and the grueling double shifts at the bar vanished. For one split second, he wasn't the Ice King and I wasn't the discarded waitress. We were just two people who had once found something real in a world made of plastic. But then the reality of the room rushed back in, the smell of the lilies, the presence of his fiancée, and the shadow of his father. Junhyuk's hand began to tremble. It was a subtle thing, but in a man who prided himself on absolute control, it was as loud as a scream. The crystal wine glass he held tilted precariously, and a single drop of deep red Cabernet spilled over the rim, falling onto the pristine white tablecloth. It looked like a drop of blood on a fresh shroud. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was drowning in the air of his own palace. "Who are these people?" Jiun finally hissed, her voice a sharp, jagged edge that cut through the silence. She looked around the room, signaling to the waiters and the guests to look away, but no one did. The elite of Seoul were frozen, gripped by the voyeuristic thrill of seeing the untouchable Kang family brought to their knees by a child. "Junhyuk, tell them to leave." "Security. Why are they just standing there?" Dae-ho didn't wait for his son to find his voice. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silver cutlery jump and clatter. The sound was like a thunderclap. "Get them out of here," he roared, his voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed malice. "Now. Before I have every one of you fired." The security detail, 4 men in identical black suits who had been hovering at the edge of the room, finally snapped into motion. They moved with a professional, lethal grace, closing the distance between us in seconds. One of them reached out a heavy hand to grab my arm, but I stepped back, my eyes never leaving Junhyuk's face. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice low and dangerous. I wasn't the scared girl who had fled into the night 12 years ago. I was a mother protecting her cub, and there was no force on earth more powerful than that. Noah didn't retreat. He didn't hide behind my dress. Instead, he took a step forward, closer to the table, closer to the man he had called father. "You have my eyes," Noah said, his voice remarkably steady for an 11-year-old. "Mama has a picture. It's old and blurry, but it's you. Why did you leave us?" The question was a dagger. I saw Junhyuk flinch as if he had been physically struck. The Ice King was melting, his eyes filling with a sudden, devastating moisture. He looked at his father, then at his fiancée, and then back at the boy who was the living proof of his greatest cowardice. The glass in his hand finally slipped, hitting the table with a muffled thud before rolling onto its side. The red wine gushed out, a dark, spreading stain that moved toward Jiun's expensive lace sleeve, but she didn't even notice. She was too busy staring at the boy's face, seeing the truth that no amount of PR could erase. "Junhyuk, say something," Daeho demanded, his face turning a dark, dangerous purple. "Tell them they're mistaken. Tell them this is a shakedown, a lie." "Security," I said, "move." The largest of the guards grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging into my collarbone. I gasped as he tried to whirl me around toward the exit. But before he could take a single step, a voice sliced through the chaos, a voice that was quiet, cold, and carried the weight of absolute command. "Take your hands off her." It was Junhyuk. He was standing now, his tall frame cast in shadow by the overhead lights. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at the guard. The man hesitated, his grip loosening just a fraction. "Junhyuk, don't be a fool," Daeho warned, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Think about the merger. Think about the family name. These are nobodies. We can handle this quietly. Don't throw everything away for a waitress and a mistake." At the word mistake, something in Junhyuk snapped. The apathy that had defined his life for a decade evaporated, replaced by a raw, burning fury. He walked around the table, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator who had finally found his target. He didn't go toward his father. He walked straight toward us. The guests held their breath. Jiun stood up, her face a mask of panicked disbelief. "Junhyuk, where are you going?" "Stay here. This is our night." He ignored her. He ignored everyone. He stopped 3 feet in front of Noah and dropped to one knee. It was an act of such profound humility that it felt like a sacrilege in a room built on pride. He was eye level with the boy now. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just inches from Noah's cheek, afraid to touch him, afraid that the boy might vanish like a ghost if he did. "Noah," he whispered, the name tasting strange and holy on his tongue. "Yes," the boy replied, his eyes searching Junhyuk's face for a sign, for a spark of the man I had told him about. "I didn't know," Junhyuk said, his voice breaking. "I swear to you. I didn't know you existed." I stood just behind my son, the red silk of my dress rustling as I breathed. I looked past Junhyuk at the old man still sitting at the table. Kang Daeho was watching his son with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He knew that in this moment, the pure legacy he had spent a lifetime protecting was being dismantled by a single, quiet conversation. He knew that the $10 million he had offered me was the worst investment he had ever made. I looked at the elite of Seoul, the men and women who thought they were the masters of the universe. They were silent now, their wine forgotten, their scandals temporarily eclipsed by a truth that was more powerful than any of their lies. I had stepped into the light, and I wasn't alone. The dinner had stopped, the empire was shaking, and for the first time in 12 years, the shadows were finally starting to lift. I looked down at my son and the man who was finally, painfully, becoming his father, and I knew that no matter what happened next, we would never be erased again. As the silence of the Crystal Palace stretched into a painful, humming void, the cold air against my skin seemed to dissolve, pulling me backward through the layers of time. The glittering chandeliers faded into the dim, amber glow of a basement bar in Itaewon, a place where the floor was always slightly tacky and the air tasted of cheap cigarettes and rain. 12 years ago, I wasn't a woman in a red silk armor. I was 22, optimistic, and working 3 jobs to keep my mother's small bakery from being swallowed by debt. That was the night I first saw him. Kang Junhyuk hadn't been the Ice King then. He was just a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders, sitting alone at the end of my bar, staring into a glass of whiskey like it held the secrets to a life he didn't want to lead. Our romance didn't start with a spark, it started with a conversation that lasted until the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline. He told me about a life governed by shadow and duty, of a father who viewed humans as chess pieces and bloodlines as sacred scriptures. I told him about the soul of the city, about the dreams I had for a life built on something more than just survival. We were 2 opposites drawn together by a shared loneliness, a secret gravity that neither of us could fight. For 6 months, we lived in a bubble of our own making. We shared street food in the rain, tucked away in corners where his father's reach couldn't touch us. He was the first person to ever truly see me, not as a foreigner, not as a waitress, but as a woman with a heart as vast as the ocean. When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't afraid. I was naive enough to believe that the love we had built was a fortress. I remember the look on his face when I told him. It was a mixture of terror and a light so bright it could have blinded me. He held me and whispered that we would find a way, that he would protect us. But the bubble didn't just pop, it was incinerated. It happened on a Tuesday morning, barely 48 hours after I'd shared the news. Jun Hyuk had been called away on family business, leaving me in our small, sun-drenched apartment. I was making tea when the knock came, not a polite tap, but a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. When I opened the door, 3 men in sharp black suits stood there, their faces as expressionless as granite. They didn't speak. They simply moved aside to make way for the patriarch. Kang Dae-ho walked into my home like he owned the air within it. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't look at the photos on the wall. He just sat at my small wooden kitchen table and looked at me with an icy disdain that made my skin crawl. "You are Mara Cole," he had said, his voice a dry rasp. It wasn't a question. He pulled an envelope from his breast pocket and laid it on the table between us. Inside was a check, already filled out. $10 million. The number was so large it felt surreal, like a prop from a movie. "This is the price for your silence and your departure. You will leave Korea by tomorrow night. You will never contact my son again. And you will terminate the complication you are currently carrying." The world had gone cold in that moment. I looked at the check, then at the man who saw my child, his own grandson, as a complication to be erased. I felt a surge of fury so hot it burned away the fear. "He loves me," I had whispered, my voice trembling. "And he will hate you for this." Dae-ho had laughed then, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "My son loves his legacy more than he loves a girl from the street. He is already being prepared for a union that matters. You are a distraction, a stain on a lineage that has remained pure for centuries. If you stay, I will not only destroy you, I will ensure your mother's bakery is leveled, your brothers are imprisoned, and your name is a curse in this city. Take the money and find a life where you belong. You do not belong here." I remembered the weight of the pen in my hand as I reached for the check. For a second, he thought he had won. I saw the smug satisfaction in his eyes, the belief that every person had a price. But I didn't sign it. I took the check in both hands and tore it down the middle, then again, and again, until the $10 million was nothing but a handful of white confetti. I threw it at his face. "My son's soul is not for sale," I told him, my voice finally finding its strength. "And neither is mine." The aftermath was a blur of systematic cruelty. Within 24 hours, the health inspectors closed my mother's bakery for violations that didn't exist. By the end of the week, our landlord had evicted us without notice. Black cars followed me everywhere, idling outside my window at 3 a.m., a constant reminder that the Kang family was watching, waiting for me to break. I tried to reach Jun Hyuk. I called every number, went to every office, but the wall was impenetrable. I was told he was away, that he didn't want to see me, that he had concurred with his father's decision. I didn't believe it then, but as the days turned into weeks and the pressure became a suffocating weight on my family, the seeds of doubt began to grow. Had he truly abandoned me? Had the Ice King's blood finally frozen his heart? I left Korea with nothing but a suitcase and a life growing inside me. I fled back to the States, to a city where I could disappear, working double shifts and sleeping on park benches until I could afford a roof over our heads. I watched Noah grow, every day seeing more of the man who had let me go. I told Noah stories of a father who was a hero, a man who would have come for us if he could. I told those lies to protect his heart, even as mine remained a jagged landscape of scars. I never touched the money. I never looked back. But as the years passed, I realized that as long as I was running, I was still under Daeho's thumb. I wasn't just coming back to Seoul for a job, I was coming back to reclaim the dignity they tried to strip away from me on that rainy Tuesday morning. The memory snapped back into the present as I looked at Jun-hyuk, who was still kneeling before Noah in the center of the Crystal Palace. The man who had been a hero in my stories and a coward in my nightmares was finally real again. I looked at Daeho, still seated at the table, his face a mask of aging fury. The price of a soul is never paid in cash, it's paid in the years lost, the words unsaid, and the courage it takes to finally stand your ground. I had worn the red dress to remind them that I was the fire they couldn't put out. 12 years ago, the Mafia patriarch thought he had bought my silence. But as I looked at my son's hand resting on his father's shoulder, I knew that the blood money had failed. Some things are simply too expensive to be bought, and a mother's love for her stain was the one debt the Khan family could never settle. The silence in the Crystal Palace was no longer the respectful hush of the elite, it was the suffocating, airless vacuum of a shipwreck. I watched Jun-hyuk closely, my breath hitching as he remained on one knee before Noah. In this high-altitude sanctuary of glass and ego, where he had spent a decade refining his coldness, the Ice King was finally, visibly thawing. His eyes, those dark, obsidian mirrors that usually reflected only business and blood, were wide and brimming with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He looked at Noah not with the suspicion of a man being conned, but with the dazed, agonizing recognition of a man seeing his own soul staring back at him from the future. He didn't need a DNA test. He didn't need the faded photograph tucked into my clutch. He saw the exact slant of his own brow, the stubborn set of a jaw that had defined the Kong lineage for generations, and a light in those eyes that he had long ago extinguished in himself. His hand, still hovering inches from Noah's face, was shaking with such violence that the heavy platinum ring on his finger caught the light in frantic, desperate glints. I could see the battle raging behind his eyes, the collision between the man he had been forced to become and the man he had once promised to be. Beside him, the air seemed to vibrate with the mounting fury of Yoo-ji-eun. She stood like a statue of ice that was beginning to crack under the heat of a public humiliation she had never imagined. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, white line of pure, unadulterated venom. She looked at the blood on Jun-hyuk's hand, red wine and glass shards mixed on his palm, and then at me. To her, I wasn't a person, I was a breach in security, a structural flaw in the skyscraper of her life that needed to be demolished. Jun-hyuk, get up, she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass that cut through the silence. She didn't lean down to help him. She stood over him, her shadow falling across him and our son like a shroud. You are making a scene. Look at who is watching. Look at the cameras. Look at your father. Jun-hyuk didn't even blink. It was as if she were a ghost, a voice from a world he no longer inhabited. He was completely mesmerized by Noah. I saw his throat move as he swallowed hard, his voice finally finding its way out of the wreckage of his composure. Noah, he murmured, the name sounding like a prayer he was learning for the first time. How old are you? I'm 11, Noah replied, his voice clear and steady. He didn't pull away from the man kneeling before him. Instead, he reached out his own small hand and gently touched the sleeve of Jun-hyuk's expensive tuxedo. Mama says you had to do important things. That you were protecting people. Is that why you didn't come? The lie I had told to save my son's heart hit Jun-hyuk harder than any bullet ever could. I saw his shoulders slump, the weight of 12 years of absence finally settling on his spine. He looked up at me then, past the boy, and for the first time since I walked through those mahogany doors, he truly saw me. He saw the fatigue in the corners of my eyes, the strength in the set of my shoulders, and the defiant red of my dress. He saw the decade of survival I had endured without him. His gaze was a plea for forgiveness that he knew he hadn't earned, and for a moment, the hatred I had carried for him felt like it was losing its grip. Junhyuk. Jiun's voice rose, no longer a whisper. She reached down and grabbed his shoulder, her manicured nails digging into the dark wool of his jacket. This is enough. Do you have any idea what this looks like? This woman is a nobody. She is a waitress from the streets. This child could be anyone's. You are the heir to the Kong Syndicate, not some character in a cheap melodrama. Get up. Now. Junhyuk finally turned his head to look at her, and the expression on his face made her recoil. The warmth he had shown Noah was gone, replaced by a gaze so frigid it seemed to drop the temperature of the entire room. It wasn't the Ice King returning to his throne, it was a man realizing he was surrounded by enemies in his own home. He slowly stood up, peeling her hand off his shoulder as if it were something unclean. He stood tall, towering over her, and for the first time in the history of their strategic partnership, the power dynamic shifted. A cheap melodrama? Junhyuk asked, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous resonance. He stepped closer to her, forcing her to take a half step back. My son is standing in front of me, Jiun. Look at him. Look at his face and tell me he is anyone's. Tell me you don't see the man I was before I became the monster your father and mine wanted. I see a disaster. Jiun hissed, her eyes darting toward the guests who were now whispering behind their hands. I see a PR nightmare that will cost us the merger. Your father will not let this stand. I will not let this stand. You are engaged to me. We are the future of this city. Not this. She gestured toward me and Noah with a flick of her hand that was dripping with elitist disgust. Across the table, Kong Dae-ho saw the cracks in his son's resolve widening, and he moved to intervene before the foundation collapsed entirely. He stood up, his presence an oppressive weight that seemed to suck the light out of the room. He didn't look at Junhyuk. He looked at me, his eyes promising a retribution that would make the last 12 years look like a vacation. Enough of this theater, Dae-ho barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Junhyuk, sit down and finish your dinner. Jiun, ignore this. Security has been instructed to handle the situation. The woman and the boy will be escorted out, and by tomorrow, this will be nothing more than a ghost story told by people who don't matter. He signaled to the guards, who had been waiting in a tense semicircle. They stepped forward, their shadows stretching across the marble toward us. One of them reached for Noah's arm, but before he could touch my son, Junhyuk moved with a speed that reminded everyone in the room exactly why he was the most feared man in the underworld. He stepped between the guard and Noah, his arm outstretched like an iron bar. Touch him, Junhyuk said, his voice a calm, lethal whisper that made the guard freeze in his tracks, and you will never see the sun rise over this city again. Not one of you. The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. The guests were no longer whispering, they were frozen in a state of collective shock. The Mafia heir was defying the patriarch in front of the entire city. Jiun looked as if she were about to faint, her carefully crafted world of status and alliances crumbling into dust. She looked at the man she was supposed to marry, the man she thought she could control through ambition and tradition, and realized he had been replaced by a father. Junhyuk turned back to us, his back to his father, his back to his fiancée, and his back to the life he had known. He reached out and, for the first time, he touched Noah. He brushed a stray hair from the boy's forehead, his hand finally steady. The look in his eyes was no longer cold, it was a melting, aching sea of regret and newfound purpose. Amara, he said, looking at me with an intensity that burned through the red silk of my dress. I was a coward. I let them tell me you were gone. I let them tell me you didn't want me. I spent 10 years trying to freeze my heart so I wouldn't have to feel the void you left behind. You let your father win, Junhyuk, I said, my voice thick with the weight of the years. You let him put a price on us. He didn't buy me, Junhyuk replied, his eyes narrowing as he glanced back at Dae-ho. He only rented me. And tonight, the lease is up. He took Noah's hand in his own, the large, scarred hand of a killer holding the small, soft hand of a child. It was the most rebellious act I had ever witnessed. In that moment, the Ice King didn't just melt, he transformed. The dinner hadn't just stopped, the dynasty had been severed. As Jiun let out a choked cry of disbelief and his father's face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage, Jun-hyuk began to lead us away from the center table. We weren't being escorted out. We were walking out together, leaving the Crystal Palace and its hollow perfection behind us, stepping into an uncertain darkness that felt, for the first time in 12 years, like the dawn. The cool night air of Seoul hit me like a physical blow as we stepped out of the pressurized, perfume-scented vacuum of the Crystal Palace. After the suffocating tension of the dining room, the wind felt honest, even if it carried the grit of the city. Jun-hyuk walked beside us, his hand still firmly anchoring Noah to this new reality. He didn't look back at the glass tower, his tower, but I did. I looked up at the shimmering spear of light reaching into the clouds and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. I knew the man we had left behind at that center table. Kang Dae-ho didn't lose, he merely paused to sharpen his blade. In his eyes, Noah wasn't a grandson, and I wasn't an old flame, we were a structural defect in his empire, a problem that had returned from the dead, and the Kang family handled problems with surgical, silent finality. "The car is coming around," Jun-hyuk said, his voice low and vibrating with the tension he was trying to hide from our son. He looked down at Noah, his expression softening in a way that seemed to pain him, as if his facial muscles weren't used to the weight of a smile. "We're going to get you somewhere safe." "Both of you?" "Safe?" I asked, pulling my thin coat tighter over my red dress. The silk felt like a target now, a vibrant beacon in the dark. "Jun-hyuk, your father's men are everywhere. There isn't a square inch of this city he doesn't monitor." The moment we walked out those doors, the hunt began. I wasn't being paranoid. I had lived through the first hunt 12 years ago. I remembered the way the black sedans would sit at the end of my street, idling like hungry predators. I remembered the way the air seemed to thicken whenever I was alone. Dae-ho didn't believe in loud confrontations, he believed in the slow, agonizing pressure that made you want to vanish just to breathe again. And now, the stakes were infinitely higher. Before, it was just me. Now, it was the foreign blood heir to his dynasty. As we stood under the grand gold-leafed canopy of the entrance, a sleek black limousine glided to the curb. The valet bowed low, his eyes averted, but I caught the way he glanced at the boy. The whispers had already traveled down 90 floors. The Ice King had a son. The scandal was a wildfire, and we were standing in the center of the dry brush. Jun-hyuk opened the door, ushering Noah inside. As I followed, I scanned the street. Across the boulevard, tucked into the shadows of a closed boutique, I saw them. 2 dark SUVs with tinted windows, their engines running, the exhaust pluming in the cold night air like the breath of beasts. They didn't move. They didn't have to. They were the hounds, waiting for the master to release the leash. "We're being followed," I whispered as the door clicked shut, sealing us in leather-scented silence. Jun-hyuk didn't turn around. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing. "I know. My father's personal security detail. They won't act yet. Not in public. He values the family name too much to have a kidnapping on the evening news. He'll wait until we're off the main thoroughfares. He'll wait for a shadow." "Mama, why are those cars staying behind us?" Noah asked, his face pressed against the glass. He was observant, far too observant for his age. He had spent his life watching me watch the world, and he had learned the language of fear without me ever teaching him a word. "They're just making sure we're okay, baby," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "Go on, look at the lights. We're going to see a different part of the city tonight." Jun-hyuk's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles looked like white stones. "Amara, I didn't know the extent of what he did back then. I knew he pushed you, I knew he offered money, but I thought you chose the money because you realized a life with me would be a life in a cage. He told me you signed the papers. He showed me a digital copy of a signature that looked exactly like yours. He's a craftsman of lies, Jun-hyuk," I said, looking at the 2 sets of headlights reflecting in the side mirror. They maintained a perfect, 3-car-length distance. It was a psychological tactic, a way of saying we are here, and we aren't going anywhere. He didn't just want me gone. He wanted you to hate me so that you would be easier to mold. He turned you into the Ice King because a man with a frozen heart doesn't ask questions about the people his father destroys. The limousine sped up, weaving through the late-night traffic of Gangnam, but no matter how many lanes Jun-hyuk changed, the shadows followed. They were professional, moving with a synchronized grace that spoke of years of training. They weren't just following, they were hurting us. Every turn Junhyuk took seemed to be anticipated. They were pushing us toward the Han River, toward the quieter, darker stretches of the industrial docks where the city's glittering lights didn't reach. He's not going to let this go, I said, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He realizes the problem has returned, and to him, Noah is a stain on his legacy. He's going to try to take him, Junhyuk. Or he's going to try to make us both disappear again. Permanently this time. Junhyuk reached over the center console, his hand finding mine. His skin was cold, but his grip was iron. He won't touch him. I spent 10 years being his shadow, learning his moves, building my own loyalties within the syndicate. He thinks these men report only to him. He's about to find out that the Ice King has his own court. Suddenly, the lead SUV accelerated, pulling alongside us. The window slid down, and for a terrifying second, I expected a weapon. Instead, I saw a man I recognized, Daeho's right hand, a man named Minho who had been with the family since before Junhyuk was born. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Junhyuk and made a slow, deliberate cutting motion across his throat before pointing toward the shoulder of the road. The command was clear, pull over and surrender the child. Don't do it, I breathed, clutching Noah to my side. I'm not, Junhyuk growled. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the powerful engine roaring as the limousine surged forward. But the SUVs were faster, lighter. They began to flank us, a pincer movement designed to force us into the concrete barrier of the bridge. Noah let out a small cry as the car swerved. The lights of the Han River blurred into long, distorted streaks of gold and blue. The city that had seemed so beautiful from the 90-floor penthouse now felt like a sprawling, carnivorous labyrinth. Hold on. Junhyuk shouted. He yanked the wheel, taking a sudden, illegal exit that led down into a maze of construction detours and half-finished overpasses. The tires screeched, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin. For a moment, the headlights behind us vanished, swallowed by the concrete pillars and the darkness of the lower levels. But the silence didn't last. A second later, the roar of engines returned, closer this time. They weren't hurting us anymore. The hunt had turned into a chase. Daeho had realized that his son wasn't just being difficult, he was defecting. And in the world of the Kong Syndicate, there was no crime greater than treason. We can't go to my apartment, I said, my voice rising in panic. They'll find us there in minutes. We aren't going to your apartment, Junhyuk said, his eyes darting to the GPS. We're going to the one place my father would never think to look. A place he thinks he destroyed 12 years ago. As we raced through the shadows, the two SUVs reappeared, flanking us again, their bumpers inches from our doors. I looked at the dark windows of the pursuing cars and felt the cold, methodical weight of Daeho's will. He had realized that his perfect, pure-blood empire was under threat by an 11-year-old boy and a woman in a red dress. He wouldn't stop until the problem was erased. The hunt had begun, and as we plunged deeper into the lightless belly of the city, I realized that tonight wouldn't end with a conversation. It would end with blood. I looked at my son, his eyes wide with a terror he shouldn't know, and I made a silent vow: if Daeho wanted a war, I would give him one that would burn his crystal palace to the ground. The tires of the heavy black sedan screeched against the damp pavement of a narrow alleyway in Itaewon, a far cry from the pristine, heated driveways of the Gangnam elite. Junhyuk had managed to lose the two SUVs in a labyrinth of construction zones near the river, but the air inside the car remained thick with a frantic, electric heat. We were silent as he parked behind a rusted dumpster, the engine ticking as it cooled. Noah had fallen into a light, fitful sleep against my shoulder, exhausted by the sheer adrenaline of the night. Junhyuk stayed behind the wheel for a long moment, his chest heaving, his hand still gripping the leather as if he were afraid the world would start spinning again if he let go. Is this where you live? He asked, his voice a ghost of its former command. He looked out the window at the crumbling brick facade of the apartment building, where laundry hung from rusted balconies and the scent of fried oil and exhaust lingered in the humid air. It's what I could afford after your father made sure I was blacklisted from every reputable establishment in the country, I replied, my voice hard. I didn't want his pity. I wanted him to see the reality of the void he had allowed his father to create. We carried Noah up the 3 flights of narrow, dimly lit stairs. The linoleum was peeling, and the yellowed wallpaper was stained with the history of 1,000 transient lives. Junhyuk looked like a giant in a dollhouse, his broad shoulders and expensive tuxedo an absurd contrast to the cramped, flickering hallway. When we reached the door, I fumbled with the 3 different locks, a habit born of a decade of looking over my shoulder, and ushered them inside. The apartment was a single room, partitioned by a thin curtain. It was clean, filled with the small comforts of a mother trying to make a home out of a survival cell, a few worn books, a potted plant struggling toward the one window, and a wall of Noah's drawings. Junhyuk laid Noah down on the small cot behind the curtain, his movements surprisingly tender. He lingered there for a moment, watching the boy breathe, before stepping back into the kitchen area, a space barely large enough for 2 people to stand. "Amara," he began, turning to face me. The Ice King was nowhere to be found. In the harsh, flickering light of the overhead fluorescent bulb, he looked raw, his face etched with a sudden, devastating age. "Tell me everything." "My father said your family was compensated. He told me the bakery was sold for a fortune and you moved to the States to start a new life with someone else. He showed me the paperwork." I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a bitter, jagged sound that tasted like copper. "Compensated? Junhyuk, your father didn't buy my family out. He burned them out." I leaned against the small, chipped countertop, my fingers digging into the edge of the wood until the splinters bit into my skin. I needed that small pain to keep from screaming. "He started with the health inspectors. They came every day for a week, citing violations that were impossible. Then the suppliers stopped delivering. My mother was told that if she sold so much as a loaf of bread to a coal, she'd be ruined. But that wasn't enough for Kang Dae-ho." Junhyuk's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening until the bones seemed ready to snap. "The night after I tore up his check," I continued, the memories rushing back with the force of a physical assault, "the bakery caught fire. The fire department took 40 minutes to arrive. The building was a total loss. My mother didn't have insurance because the company had cancelled it 2 days prior without explanation. She lost everything, her livelihood, her retirement, the legacy she wanted to leave for me. She died 6 months later from a broken heart, believing she had failed us. My brothers were arrested on trumped-up drug charges within the month. They spent 2 years in a detention center before the charges were quietly dropped after I finally left the country. That was the fortune your father gave us, Junhyuk. He turned my family name into a curse." Junhyuk recoiled as if I had struck him. He reached out a hand, perhaps to touch me, but I pulled away, the red silk of my dress rustling like an angry flame. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to him. I was told you were the one who wanted the money. He said you realized a half-foreign child would be a burden to your ambitions. He made me believe that the only person I ever truly loved had betrayed me for a price tag." "And you believed him?" I hissed, moving closer to him until our chests were almost touching. "You knew the man he was. You knew the blood that built your empire. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than fighting him. It was easier to become the Ice King than to be a man who had to live with the fact that he failed the woman he loved." The confrontation was raw, stripped of the elegance of the Crystal Palace. Here, in the belly of a neighborhood the Kong Syndicate would never acknowledge, the truth was a jagged blade. Junhyuk sank into the one wooden chair at the table, his head in his hands. The silence of the apartment was punctuated only by the distant hum of the city and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the son he hadn't known he had. "I spent 10 years trying to become the man he wanted," Junhyuk said into his palms. "I thought if I was ruthless enough, if I was successful enough, the hole you left would stop hurting. I thought power would make me untouchable. But tonight, when I saw him, when I saw Noah..." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrifying clarity. "I realized I'd been a prisoner in a palace for 12 years. I'm not the Ice King, Amara. I'm just a shadow he cast to keep the world in the dark." "He's coming for us, Junhyuk," I said, the anger in me cooling into a sharp, cold fear. "You know he is. He won't let this end with a conversation. He won't let a foreigner and a stain live to tell the story of his failure. He sees Noah as a threat to the purity of your bloodline." Junhyuk stood up, his stature returning, but it was different now. The coldness was gone, replaced by a slow-burning, lethal heat. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone, his fingers moving with a practiced, military precision. He thinks he owns the loyalty of every man in the syndicate, Junhyuk said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He thinks they follow him because they fear him. But I've spent 10 years in the trenches with them. I bled with them while he sat in his penthouse. He's about to find out that fear is a weak currency when compared to respect. He looked at me then, really looked at me, through the layers of red silk and the decade of survival. I can't give you back your mother. I can't give you back the years we lost. But I can give you a future where you don't have to look over your shoulder. I'm going to end this tonight, Amara. Not as his heir, but as Noah's father. The air in the small apartment shifted. The hunt was no longer just about us running, it was about the king being hunted by his own shadow. Junhyuk walked to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds at the dark street below. I knew what he was looking for, the black SUVs, the men in suits, the silent reach of his father. Pack what you need, he commanded, his eyes still fixed on the street. We leave in 5 minutes. My father's reach is long, but I know the cracks in his armor. We're going to a place where his money doesn't mean anything. We're going to find the men who are tired of being pieces on his chessboard. I looked at Noah, still sleeping peacefully behind the curtain, unaware that his presence had just started a war that would likely end in blood. I looked at the red dress, stained now with the grime of the city and the wine of a ruined dinner. I had spent 12 years running from the Kangs, and tonight, I was walking back into the fire with the very man who had sparked it. Where are we going? I asked, grabbing a small backpack and shoving Noah's few cherished toys inside. Junhyuk turned back to me, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a dark, dangerous thing that reminded me he was still a man born of the underworld. We're going to see an old friend of my father's, he said. Someone he betrayed almost as badly as he betrayed you. It's time to remind the patriarch that an empire built on fear only stands until someone stops being afraid. As we slipped out of the apartment and into the lightless alleyway, the city felt different. The neon lights of Seoul weren't just decorations anymore, they were the markers of a battlefield. The secret meeting had ended, the truth had been told, and the Ice King had finally melted, not into water, but into fire. And as the engine of the black sedan roared back to life, I knew that the next time I saw Kang Dae-ho, it wouldn't be as a waitress. It would be as the woman who helped his son tear his kingdom to the ground. The silence of the safe house was a heavy, suffocating blanket. We had moved from my apartment to a hidden cellar beneath a defunct textile factory on the outskirts of Incheon, a place that smelled of damp concrete and industrial grease. Junhyuk had gone out an hour ago to make the calls, leaving me alone with Noah in the dim, flickering light of a single bare bulb. My son was asleep on a pile of moth-eaten moving blankets, his breathing the only rhythmic, peaceful thing in a world that had turned into a nightmare of shadows and steel. I sat on the cold floor, the hem of my red silk dress tattered and stained with the soot of the city, clutching a rusted iron pipe I'd found in the corner. It was a pathetic weapon against the kind of men Kang Dae-ho employed, but it was all I had. I knew the cleanup crew was coming. In the underworld, they were the janitors of the elite, men who didn't exist on any payroll, whose job was to ensure that problems vanished without leaving a trace of blood on the white marble of the Kang legacy. 12 years ago, they had used fire and bureaucracy to chase me away. Tonight, I knew they would use something much more permanent. The patriarch couldn't afford a second chance for the stain to speak. The sound began as a low, rhythmic thrumming in the distance, the sound of heavy tires on gravel. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I crawled over to Noah, shielding his small body with mine. "Wake up, baby," I whispered into his ear, my voice trembling. "We have to be very, very quiet." Noah opened his eyes, his pupils dilating in the darkness, and he didn't cry. He saw the look on my face and understood that the game we were playing had turned deadly. Above us, the heavy iron door of the factory groaned on its hinges. I heard the synchronized footsteps of men who moved with military precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 of them. They weren't hiding their presence anymore. They knew we were trapped in the belly of this concrete beast. "Amara Cole," a voice called out, echoing through the cavernous space above. It was Minho, the man from the SUV, the one who had made the cutting motion across his throat. His voice was devoid of emotion, as sterile as a surgical theater. There is no need to make this difficult for the boy. Mr. Kong wants this handled with discretion. If you cooperate, his end will be quick. The cruelty of the words made me feel sick, but it also lit a fire in my gut that burned away the last of my fear. I stood up, gripping the iron pipe, standing in front of my son like a lioness. I watched the stairs. The first shadow appeared at the top of the flight, a tall man in a tactical vest, silenced submachine gun held across his chest. He looked down at us with the detached curiosity of a gardener looking at a weed. But then, another sound cut through the silence. Not from the stairs, but from the main floor of the factory. A screech of tires, a crash of metal, and the roar of an engine that sounded like a predator's scream. The man at the top of the stairs turned, his weapon raised, but he was too late. A black sedan had smashed through the secondary loading bay, and a figure stepped out into the industrial glare of the factory's floodlights. It was Jun Hyuk. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket anymore, his white shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing the scars on his forearms, and he held a heavy handgun with the practiced ease of a man who had been born with steel in his palm. Minho. Jun Hyuk's voice roared through the factory, sounding like a peal of thunder. Step away from the stairs. The cleanup crew froze. They were Daeho's soldiers, yes, but for 10 years, they had looked to Jun Hyuk as their field commander. They had seen him lead them through the bloodiest territory disputes in the city's history. The air in the factory became a physical weight as the soldiers found themselves caught between the old king and the new. Minho stepped to the railing, looking down at Jun Hyuk. Sir, your father gave a direct order. The lineage must be preserved. The stain must be removed. Do not make us choose between you and the syndicate. The syndicate is a collection of men, Minho, not a collection of lies, Jun Hyuk replied, his voice dropping into that low, lethal register I had heard at the restaurant. He began to walk toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving the soldier. My father sits in a palace built on your bodies. He asks you to kill a child because he is afraid of a drop of blood that isn't pure. Look at me. I am the man you followed into the docks. I am the man who bled with you. And I am telling you, if you take one more step toward my son, you are no longer my brothers. You are targets. The man at the top of the stairs hesitated. He looked at Minho, then back at Jun Hyuk. The cleanup crew was built on the premise that they were invisible, but here, under the harsh light of betrayal, they felt exposed. Kill him, Minho commanded, his voice cracking with the strain of the moment. The patriarch's orders are absolute. The soldier at the railing raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. I screamed, throwing myself over Noah, waiting for the staccato burst of gunfire that would end everything. But the shot that rang out wasn't from a submachine gun. It was a single, precise crack from a handgun. The soldier at the top of the stairs slumped over the railing, his weapon clattering to the concrete floor below. Jun Hyuk didn't stop moving. He was a force of nature, moving with a calculated, lethal grace. He fired again, a second shot that caught another guard who had emerged from the shadows of the machinery. Run, Amara! Jun Hyuk yelled, his eyes finding mine for a split second. To the back exit. Now. I grabbed Noah and bolted toward the rear of the cellar, but Minho was already moving to intercept us. He vaulted over the railing, landing on the stairs with a heavy thud. He was a veteran, a man who had survived a dozen wars, and he didn't care about the boy, he only cared about the mission. He leveled his weapon at us, his eyes cold and empty. Discretion is over, Minho hissed. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But instead of the burn of a bullet, I heard a sickening thud. I opened my eyes to see Jun Hyuk had tackled Minho, the two men crashing into a pile of rusted metal crates. They were a blur of violence, fists, knees, and the dull gleam of a knife. Jun Hyuk wasn't fighting like a Mafia boss, he was fighting like a man who was exorcising 10 years of demons. He took a blow to the ribs that would have sidelined a lesser man, but he didn't even flinch. He grabbed Minho's head and slammed it into the concrete floor with a final, brutal impact. Minho went limp. Jun Hyuk stood up, gasping for air, his white shirt now stained with oil and blood. He looked around the factory. The remaining 3 soldiers of the cleanup crew were standing in the shadows, their weapons lowered. They saw the man their Ice King had become, not a monster of detachment, but a father who had fought through hell to stand in their way. "Go home," Junhyuk told them, his voice ragged. "Tell my father that the cleanup failed. Tell him that if he wants the boy, he has to come through me himself." The soldiers looked at each other, then slowly faded back into the darkness, the roar of their vehicles fading as they retreated. They were the cleanup crew, but they knew when a mess was too large to be swept under a rug. Junhyuk turned to us. He stumbled toward the cellar entrance, his legs nearly giving out. I ran to him, catching him before he hit the ground. He smelled of cordite and sweat, but as he looked at Noah, who was peeking out from behind my dress, the hardness in his face dissolved into something so tender it made my heart ache. Are you okay?" Junhyuk wheezed, his hand reaching out to touch Noah's hair. "You saved us," Noah whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "You're like the hero in Mama's stories." Junhyuk looked at me, a tear finally tracking through the grime on his cheek. "I'm not a hero, Noah. I'm just a man who's done being a coward." I helped him to the car, the red silk of my dress finally shredded beyond repair. We had survived the cleanup crew, but the stain was now a permanent mark on the Kong Empire. As we drove away from the factory, the sky beginning to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple, I knew that the hunt wasn't over. Daeho would be furious, but for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't afraid of the shadows. Because the Ice King had stood in the way of the darkness, and he hadn't moved. We weren't just a problem to be solved anymore. We were a family, and as the engine roared toward the horizon, I knew that the throne of glass was finally, beautifully, on fire. The blue-black hour before dawn always felt like the time when the world was most honest, when the pretenses of the day had collapsed and only the bare, cold truth remained. We didn't head back to the shadows of the docks or the cramped safety of my apartment. Instead, Junhyuk drove the black sedan straight back toward the heart of the beast, toward the Crystal Palace. I watched the neon lights of Seoul begin to flicker out as the sun threatened to rise, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure adrenaline against my ribs. Beside me, Noah was awake, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wasn't crying, he was watching the profile of the man driving us, the father who had just killed for him, with a look of terrifyingly clear understanding. Junhyuk didn't speak until we pulled into the VIP basement entrance of the tower. He turned off the engine, and for a moment, the only sound was the metallic ticking of the cooling car. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror, at the blood on his white shirt, the shadow of the man who had spent a decade playing a role. Then, he looked back at us. "My father's power doesn't come from his money," Junhyuk said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It comes from the myth he built. The myth of the pure Kong lineage, the untouchable dynasty. Tonight, we aren't just surviving. We are ending the myth." He led us not to the restaurant, but to the tower's private press and banquet hall on the 85th floor. It was a space usually reserved for announcing mergers and political endorsements, a room designed to project absolute authority. As the elevator climbed, the numbers ticking upward like a countdown, I smoothed the tattered remains of my red dress. I was a mess of stained silk and raw nerves, but as the door slid open, I realized that the cleanup crew had failed in more ways than one. The news of the incident at dinner had traveled faster than Daeho's ability to suppress it. The lobby was already teeming with reporters, board members, and high-ranking syndicate associates, all of them hovering like vultures waiting for a carcass. Junhyuk didn't hide. He didn't slip through a back entrance. He walked straight through the center of the crowd, his hand resting firmly on Noah's shoulder. The gasps were audible, a wave of shock that rippled through the room as the elite saw their Ice King covered in the grime of a street war, accompanied by the stain and the waitress. At the far end of the hall, standing on a podium beneath the massive gold crest of the Kong family, stood Daeho. Beside him was Yu Jiun, her face a mask of frozen, aristocratic fury. She looked at us with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. Daeho, however, looked like a man who was watching his life's work catch fire. He was surrounded by microphones, preparing to deliver a statement that would surely frame tonight as a terrorist intrusion or a misunderstanding. Junhyuk, Daeho's voice boomed over the speakers, his tone of forced, fatherly concern that made my skin crawl. "You've been through a traumatic ordeal. Come, step up here. Let us tell the people the truth together." These people, this woman, they have manipulated the situation. Jun Hyuk didn't stop until he was at the base of the podium. He looked up at his father, the man who had tried to buy his son's soul for $10 million, and then he stepped up onto the stage. He didn't take the seat offered to him. He walked straight to the main microphone. The silence that followed was absolute. Every camera in the room was focused on Jun Hyuk's blood-stained shirt and Noah's defiant, dark eyes. For 10 years, Jun Hyuk began, his voice amplified until it shook the glass walls. I have been told that the strength of this family lies in its purity. I was told that our blood was a legacy that could not be diluted, a crown that required the sacrifice of everything human within us. My father taught me that power is a wall we build to keep the world out. He paused, looking directly at Ji-yoon. Ji-yoon, you are a woman of immense status and ambition. You were chosen for me because you fit the architecture of that wall. But a wall is just a different name for a prison. Tonight, I am breaking the engagement. Not because of a scandal, but because a life built on a lie is a life that has already failed. Ji-yoon's face contorted, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer clutch. You're throwing away everything, Jun Hyuk. For her? For a mistake? Jun Hyuk reached down and pulled Noah up onto the podium beside him. The boy stood tall, his small hand finding Jun Hyuk's. The cameras flashed in a blinding strobe of white light. This is not a mistake, Jun Hyuk said, and the tenderness in his voice was more shocking to the crowd than any confession of a crime. This is Noah. He is my son. He is the half of me that I tried to kill 12 years ago because I was too much of a coward to stand up to a man who values gold over blood. My father told me that this boy's foreign blood was a stain. But looking at him tonight, I realize that he is the only pure thing this family has ever produced. Dae-ho stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. Sit down, Jun Hyuk. You are destroying the syndicate. You are ruining the merger. I will disown you. You will have nothing. Jun Hyuk turned to face his father, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look like a shadow. He looked like the sun. I already have nothing, father. I have spent a decade in a room full of money and ghosts. You can keep the towers. You can keep the accounts. You can keep the name. Jun Hyuk reached up and unpinned the gold Kong family crest from his lapel, the symbol of the pure dynasty. He held it over the edge of the podium and let it drop. It hit the floor with a hollow, tinny sound. My lineage doesn't belong to a syndicate, Jun Hyuk said, turning back to the microphones. It belongs to the woman who had the courage to raise my son in the shadows while I was hiding in the light. Amara Cole is not a waitress. She is the mother of the future of this family. And if that future doesn't involve your pure dynasty, then the dynasty deserves to die. He walked off the stage then, ignoring the erupting chaos of the press, ignoring his father's screamed curses and Ji-yoon's tears. He walked straight to me. He took my hand, his grip warm and solid, and together we walked through the crowd. The lions parted for us now, not out of fear, but out of a stunned, begrudging respect. As we reached the elevators, I looked back one last time. Dae-ho was standing alone on the podium, his empire of glass and steel still standing, but the soul of it was gone. He had lost the Ice King, and in doing so, he had lost his future. We stepped out into the morning air, the sun finally breaking over the Seoul skyline. The light was pale and new, washing over the city and the red silk of my dress. Jun Hyuk looked at me, and for the first time in 12 years, the Ice King was completely gone. There was only a man, a woman, and a child. Where to now? I asked, my voice finally finding its peace. Jun Hyuk looked at Noah, then back at me. Home, Amara. For real this time. The lineage had been broken, but as we walked toward the car, I realized that we hadn't just destroyed a dynasty. We had finally, beautifully, started our own. The morning sun didn't just rise over Seoul, it felt like it was clearing away a decade of fog that had settled deep in my bones. 2 years have passed since the night the Crystal Palace became a tomb for the Kong dynasty's ego, and as I stand on the balcony of our home, the air no longer tastes of filtered gold and cold ambition. It tastes of salt from the nearby sea and the sweet, yeasty aroma of the bakery I reopened, not as a small, struggling shop in an alleyway, but as a sanctuary that bears my mother's name in bold, proud letters. I am no longer the woman in the tattered red dress, the waitress who had to make herself invisible just to survive. I am a woman who reclaimed her space in a world that tried to erase her, and I did it without sacrificing a single drop of the blood they called a stain. Behind me, the glass doors slide open with a soft hum. I don't have to turn around to know the rhythm of the footsteps. Jun Hyuk walks onto the balcony, his presence no longer carrying the sharp, jagged edge of the Ice King. He's dressed in a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that no longer hold the weight of an underworld empire. He walked away from the syndicate that morning at the press conference, leaving the towers, the offshore accounts, and the blood-soaked legacy to a father who had nothing left to govern but ghosts. People said he was crazy to trade a multi-billion-dollar throne for a life of quiet uncertainty, but as he wraps his arms around my waist and rests his chin on my shoulder, I know he feels like the richest man in the world. Noah is almost ready, Jun Hyuk murmurs, his voice warm against my ear. He's currently trying to convince me that he needs a second breakfast because growing boys require extra fuel. He sounds more like you every day. I laugh, a sound that comes easily now, unburdened by the constant monitoring of the shadows. He has your stubbornness, Jun Hyuk. Don't blame that on me. We look out over the garden where Noah is currently racing a golden retriever across the grass. At 13, he is stretched out, his limbs long and athletic, his face a perfect, harmonious bridge between two worlds. He isn't a foreign complication anymore, he is a child of the city, a boy who knows he is loved by a father who isn't a ghost in a photograph. Watching them together, Jun Hyuk and Noah, is the most profound redemption I have ever witnessed. It wasn't enough for Jun Hyuk to just provide for him, he had to learn how to be a father, to trade the language of commands for the language of bedtime stories and soccer drills. He had to learn that power isn't found in a signet ring, but in the way a child looks at you when they've had a bad dream. Our new empire isn't built of glass and steel. It's built on the foundation of the scholarship fund Jun Hyuk started for children who, like Noah once was, are marginalized by the systems of power. He used what remained of his personal, clean assets to build something that his father could never understand, a legacy of presence rather than a legacy of possession. Kang Dae-ho still sits in his high tower, I'm told, a bitter old man presiding over a crumbling dynasty that no longer has an heir. The purity he cherished so much has left him entirely alone. He has all the money in the world, and yet, he has never been poorer. I often think back to that night at the restaurant, to the weight of the red silk and the terror in my throat when Noah first said that word, father. I realize now that the dinner didn't just stop for the Kangs, it stopped for me, too. It was the end of my life as a victim of their cruelty. When I walked out of those doors holding my son's hand, I wasn't just leaving a mafia boss, I was stepping into my own light. I realized that the strength I had used to survive 12 years of exile was the same strength I could use to build a life of joy. Noah shouts from the garden, waving a soccer ball in the air. Dad. Come on. You promised. Jun Hyuk looks at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I nod, nudging him toward the stairs. I watch as he runs down to the grass, his laughter echoing against the stone walls of our home. There is no Ice King here. There is no stain. There is only a family that refused to be broken by the lies of a dying empire. I look at the small gold band on my finger, not a Kong family heirloom, but a simple ring we bought together in a small shop by the docks. It represents a union that wasn't brokered by lawyers or patriarchs, but by a choice to forgive the unforgivable and to build something beautiful from the wreckage. My mother's bakery is thriving, my brothers are home, and my son has a father who would tear down the sky to keep him safe. If my story has taught me anything, it's that our choices always find their way back to us. Kang Dae-ho chose fear and isolation, and that is what he has. We chose the truth, even when it burned, and we found our way home. The path was longer and more winding than I ever imagined, but the view from here, watching my husband and son play in the morning sun, is more beautiful than any sunset from the 91st floor. The Ice King didn't just melt. He became the sun. And as I turn to go back inside to start the coffee and begin another day in this empire of our own making, I realize that some things are truly too expensive to be bought. A soul, a family, and a love that defies the world are the only riches that matter. In the end, we didn't just survive the Kangs. We outshined them. And as I hear Noah's triumphant shout as he scores a goal, I know that the problem the patriarch tried to erase is now the greatest victory of our lives. Sometimes the universe brings you exactly what you need, even when it arrives in a red dress at a dinner that was never meant for you. Sometimes our greatest mistakes lead to our most profound redemptions. And sometimes, the most powerful word in any language isn't empire or power. It's father. It's home. I am Amara Cole, and I am no longer waiting for the dinner to stop. I am finally, beautifully, at the table. Thank you so much for walking this path with me today. This story is a reminder that no matter how much power someone has, they can never take away your truth or your worth. If Amara's courage or Junhyuk's redemption touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community. Your support is what allows me to keep bringing these stories of justice, love, and second chances to life. I truly value every single person in this audience, and I'd love to know who I'm speaking to today. If you haven't done it yet, please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from. Whether you're in Seoul, New York, Lagos, or London, I want to see how far our message of strength has traveled. Until the next story, remember, your past doesn't define you, and it is never too late to choose the truth. I'll see you in the comments.